Congratulations, Timothy, for Homelands. It was a privilege to travel back with you as you trace the history of freedom and progress, and then escort us oh so carefully and lyrically through the challenges that we face. Thank you for writing this.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you all here to the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. My name is Peter Lowen, and I have the great pleasure of being the director of the school and of welcoming you here today for this great event. Before we begin the formal proceedings, I do want to acknowledge the land on which we are seated. The University of Toronto operates on land that has for thousands of years been the traditional home of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we're rightfully thankful to be able to live and to work on this piece of Turtle Island. This is a wonderful event for us at the Munk School, and it's something that we do annually and have been doing for a long time, and it's always a great pleasure when this comes in our calendar. Today we're awarding the Lionel Gelber Prize, and I'm not going to say much because I'm going to introduce someone who's going to introduce everyone else, which gives you a sense of how important this is. But for the Munk School to be the home and the steward of the Lionel Gelber Prize, which recognizes the most important book in international affairs published in the previous year, is a real honor. It's something that has brought esteem to our school for a long time and has given us the great pleasure of being able to welcome really intellectual bright lights like Timothy Garton Ash to our school. So to introduce the proceedings and to talk about the prize, I'm very, very pleased to welcome as a representative of the Gelber family, Judith Gelber. And before I invite Judith and you give her a very, very warm round of applause, I do want to thank the whole Gelber family, all the way back to Lionel Gelber, who you may know was an extremely dashing and ambitious Canadian public servant who wanted Canada's role in the world to really matter. And this prize that he's endowed, in which we have the great honor of stewarding, I think helps Canada do that just more than a little bit. So with that, Judith, you're such a great friend of the school, and I want to invite you to the podium and invite you all to welcome Judith Gelber. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That's quite some welcome. And I'd like to welcome everyone to the 35th Annual Lionel Gelber Prize presentation. It's a pleasure to be with you today to celebrate our 2024 winner, Timothy Garton Ash. And I want to thank you, Peter, on behalf of the Lionel Gelber Prize Board for your continuing support, tremendous support and leadership for the prize and for the Munk School. As well, I'm going to do a shout out to Ariana Bradford, who's the executive director of the Munk School. She and her hardworking staff put this prize together, and so I want to thank you very much as well. As Peter mentioned, new to the prize, we have some grad students who have formed the Gelber Prize Book Club, and which is kind of exciting for us. So the Lionel Gelber Prize was envisioned by my uncle, Lionel Gelber, and it was founded in 1990. Upon graduation from the University of Toronto, Lionel won a Rhodes Scholarship to study at Balliol College, Oxford, and this was in 1930, and he loved it there. And only the war would have dragged him home. He loved England. He spent many later years living in London. His world was one of study and research, practice in the field of international affairs, advisor to governments and politicians, but mostly of writing books, and particularly on how he saw the power balance change post-war. His great legacy is this prize. As Peter mentioned, the Lionel Gelber Prize was established to recognize the book deemed Best of the Year, published in English, on international affairs. Lionel emphasized that the book must be judged to deepen public debate on significant international issues. Importantly, it had to be written in a style that could be easily read and enjoyed by the general public, as well as the scholarly crowd. Well, Homelands, A Personal History of Europe, certainly meets all those criteria. But even more, I know that my Uncle Lionel would not only have loved Homelands, but as a great Anglophile, I can just picture him sitting with Timothy and arguing and commenting on every last one of his observations. So every year I stand up and I say, I love this book. And this year, with Homelands, Timothy Garton Ash has given us a thorough story of post-war World War II Europe from his own on-the-ground experiences. With his dry British wit, you will find that it's also lots of fun. So be aware, what looks like a modest read in terms of length will take you at least twice as long because, like life, your mind will be racing to keep up with the politics, the people, the events, and the landscape. You will be intrigued, saddened, astounded, and educated. I mean, who else would take you from Thatcher and Gorbachev to Milosevic and Havel with a quick nod to Meg Ryan and then off to the creation of the euro, all this in the middle section. So you come away breathless. So how do we have such a winning book? Well, a prize is only as good as its jury. Our distinguished jury of 5 for the 2024 $50,000 Lionel Gelber Prize heeded well all the guidelines. Chaired by the inimitable Janice Stein, founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, advisor to prime ministers, professor of conflict management, led the jury, as she has for many years. Our other jurors are, for the third time, Frank Gavin from Washington, founding director of the Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins University, and chair of nuclear policy studies at MIT. His most recent book, Nuclear Weapons and American Nuclear Strategy, is a must-read in today's climate. And I have to tell you, I've read it, and it's really fascinating what you will learn, particularly since we've been hearing maybe too much about nuclear weapons over the last couple of years. Also from Washington, and for the second year, Rosa Brooks, journalist, author, and law school professor at Georgetown University. Ian Martin, based in London, columnist for the Times of London, author, and director of the London Defense Conference. And Eric Regoli, award-winning Canadian journalist, author, and outstanding Globe and Mail European bureau chief from Rome. So the Prize Board and the Munk School are ever so grateful for your insight, time, and expertise, let alone final agreement on a great winner. And thank you for being here today. And with that, I pass the podium over to Janice. We hope you enjoy your afternoon.
Thank you so much, Judith. And let me just take a moment to echo what Judith said. Peter Lowen has provided unstinting support for the prize since he became director. You can never take that for granted, but Peter has been just superb. And sitting next to Peter is Ariana, who, what words of praise do we use here, Peter, for the leadership that she and her team have provided. So thank you both. And of course, thank you to the Gelber family. I say this every year. I think my colleagues on the jury would agree. We need families like the Gelber family that care about the mission, care about quality, care about education, and care about writing. And that is this generation of the Gelber family. So there really isn't enough thank yous. So Judith preempted me because I was going to thank the 3 very tall jurors this year. You know what, and we do our work on Zoom, and then we met last night, And oh my God, am I vertically challenged, is all I can say here. If you saw the four of us walking down the street, you're all entitled to a chuckle, is all I can say. So let me just say a personal word about each of them, because Judith has already told you what a distinguished group this is and what they all bring to the prize. Rosa Brooks, who could not be here, I think, Frank, we might say about Rosa that she ran in 2016 a tabletop exercise about what would happen in the United States if Donald Trump were elected president. She was one of the few who took it seriously, worried not only about the impact on democracy, but the impact on military-civil relations. One of the reasons Rose is not here is she is running the same tabletop exercise this year. But this time I think a lot of people are taking her more seriously. She was just a superb member of the jury, and she's short, okay? Because I know her personally. Frank Gavin is just one of these rare people. Just a fine, fine scholar in the truest sense of the word, but who cares about the world and what is going on, reaches out far beyond his discipline, convenes scholars with policymakers and journalists, and does this not only in the United States, but in Sweden, in London. I've seen him do it. And so no more perfect juror for the Gelber Prize. In a sense, almost channels what your uncle cared about. Ian brings just a superb perspective. The way we organized ourselves, Timothy, for the jury meetings is each one of us had a different book to talk about. And by the outcome, I can tell you that Ian made the most stellar presentation of Homelands, because he was the juror who summarized that book for the rest of us. So it was just a delight to have Ian with us, and having that perspective of Europe in our midst as we consider the finest writing, which is also intelligent, makes all the difference. Eric is homegrown. All of you know Eric from his writing. What I can say about Eric, as the jury met, he spent much of the time in Kyiv in the last few months. Not, as Eric said honestly, reporting at the front line, but reporting on the politics, on the economics, on the military. And like all of us who have thought hard about Ukraine in the last 2.5 years, leaves Ukraine worried, concerned, chastened about how do we describe, about the fecklessness of allies at a time when Ukraine is now defending itself with a 1-to-10 ratio of artillery and ammunition. Just before Eric came home, because this is home to Eric, he went from Rome to Cairo, where you will read what Eric has to say. I hope some of you saw that really moving column that Eric wrote 10 days ago about his longtime friend Nada in Gaza. If you haven't seen it, go look for it. It's a human story that transcends so much of what we do most of the day. So this was the dream jury, is all I can tell you. I can honestly say, Judith, I've been doing this for years, never had a better jury. And that's why they were smart enough to choose this book, okay? Let me say a word about the other 4 books that were nominated. I will also say this was, I think, our best shortlist. And that's what Frank said to me, because he has been, and Rosa, because they had been on the jury before. And just to take a step back for a second and talk about where we are in the world, when people ask me, I say we are in the middle of 3 intersecting revolutions, each one of them potentially transformative, but for these to join together at the same time is what makes our times extraordinary, challenging, and frankly dangerous in a way that we, certainly in my lifetime, I have not seen before. The first of these is a revolution that is familiar to all of you, which is the technological revolution. AI is a general purpose technology, and whatever we think of it, it is, equivalent to electricity in the change that it will have over the next 2 or 3 decades, and it's coming at us apace. Now, Wendy Wong's book, We the Data, is an early and important entry into that conversation. How do we think about data? Who owns it? How do we think about privacy? How do we think about rights? In a world that will be increasingly digital, far more by orders of magnitude, as the AI revolution continues to gather steam. The second revolution is a very important one, too. It's an economic revolution, and it is a deep questioning of the neoliberal, not liberal, but neoliberal orthodoxy around free trade. That has shaped the last 30 years for a whole variety of reasons. And that is joined up with an enhanced national security agenda. So these two are now linked again. They have been before in history, but they are now linked again in new ways. And 7 Crashes is actually quite a remarkable book. It is by Harold James, a friend of Timothy's, and a wonderful, wonderful historian, economic historian. It looks at something in a way that we haven't looked at it quite before, which is supply-driven crises and supply-driven recessions. We talk about demand often, but this he brings together in an absolutely fascinating story 7 of these supply crises and makes us think hard about how these are joined up. Now, these first 2, the economic and the technological revolution, are in fact connected to the third one, which is the geopolitical revolution. We summarize this in plain English, which the Gelber family always appreciates, which is big power competition is back. Now that's in a funny way misleading because it never went away, but it is back in a different way because it is deeply connected to the first one, to the technological revolution, and it's expressing itself in that technological revolution. So there's Darren Acemoglu's book and Simon Johnson's book, Power and Prosperity. And we had dinner with the jurors because we knew each other from Zoom, but we were able to meet in person like last night. And we told Timothy there was a really great, vigorous debate in the jury, which is what any jury chair hopes for, precisely because of these connections. Acemoglu and Johnson look at the welfare-generating consequences of technology. How do the benefits from technology get distributed? How does that play into the populist politics that we are all facing in one way or another? And it is a very, very, very important book. It is not as easy a read as some of the others, but if you have the fortitude, I would say this is a must-read book for all of us if we want to understand where we're going. And closely connected to these same themes, technology, economics, and geopolitics, is the 4th book by 2 scholars who are also people who engage with the world all the time, Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman, have written a book called Underground Empire: How America Weaponized the World Economy. and it's a really, really important argument. It's controversial, but it's really important. It is because the United States is the global financial power, still unchallenged. It is because the dollar is the global reserve currency, that everything passes through the United States, which enables the United States to impose sanctions, for example, and this is only one example, in a way that no other great power can. There are costs to weaponizing the global economy, but it is a really important book. Now, all of this comes together in Homelands, all joined up, all these themes. And Judith has already said a little bit. Timothy is going to say much more. But when we as a juror were talking about Homelands, I can't quite remember which one of us said it, which is a nice trick because I can claim it, but I don't think it was me. I think it was one of the three of you who said, this is a love letter. This is a love letter to the Europe that Timothy saw as a young man when he first began his career and traveled through Europe even as a young man, which is so important, to the Europe that Timothy saw become, and then the sadness that is in this book. As, again, Timothy walked through so much of this, always traveling, always speaking to people, always finding the story that doesn't make it onto the front pages or the online material that we read, and telling that story to connect up the themes. The best writing, frankly, joins up themes. It doesn't silo. Nobody would organize a university today if they were starting from scratch into separate departments, because all these issues, that is, I think, what is magic about the Munk School, that we don't do that. But Timothy's book, The Homelands, is the ultimate expression of that. And so I'm going to say a brief word. Timothy is a polymath, right? It's very hard to describe you, Timothy. And what I can say is, once we made the selection, our jury, many of whom knew you, talked about what a wonderful choice this was of author as well as book. I told Timothy last night, Harold James, one of the shortlisted writers, when I told him that Timothy's book had won, and he was one of 5 shortlisted, the comment that came back to me in a minute, isn't that wonderful? I would have voted for him myself. And he said, as soon as I'm allowed to, I am going to write to Timothy. That is the kind of relationship that Timothy Garton Ash has built with students, with graduate students, with fellow writers. There is a genuine liberal openness to Timothy as he listens to arguments, and he actively listens to arguments that he disagrees with. And I think, more than anything else, that's what makes Timothy Garton Ash the scholar and the writer that he is. This is a lyrical love story to a liberal Europe that embodied so many of our hopes. Timothy, over to you.
Well, thank you both so much for those introductions. What a build-up. It's going to be hard to live up to. Thank you so much to the Gelber family for the prize. Thank you to Janice and the jurors for awarding it to me. What a spectacular list of winners over the last 35 years. It really is a who's who of the best non-fiction on international affairs. So it's a huge honor to have the prize. It's a great pleasure to be back at the Munk School, where I've been many, many times, Peter. You can't keep me away. I was actually last September only, talking about this book. To be back in Canada. I actually have more Canadian cousins, nephews and nieces, than I have British ones. And it's wonderful to have several of them here to be with us today. Also, my oldest son lives in Vancouver and is becoming a Canadian citizen, so Canada is well on the way to becoming another of my homelands. And of course, Canada, I mean, you have a few problems, but nonetheless, a prosperous, peaceful, stable, liberal democracy dedicated to the rule of law, a tolerant, decent, multicultural society, and with two official languages, English and French. You're a perfect member state of the EU. By the way, that's a compliment, in case you were wondering, coming from me. It's also, of course, a joke, but it's a joke that has a point to it, because one of the fascinating things about Europe is that it's so complicated. There are all these different Europes, geographical, historical, cultural, political, philosophical, and Europe doesn't end at any clear line, except possibly the North Pole, where it ends at a point. But otherwise, Europe doesn't end, it just fades away. It fades away across the vast expanse of Eurasia, across Russia, across Turkey. It fades away to the south across the Mediterranean, the Mare Nostrum of the ancient Romans and Greeks. If you told them that the line between Europe and not Europe ran through the middle of the Mediterranean, they wouldn't have believed what you were saying. And across the Atlantic, by the way, both north and south. English-speaking and Spanish and Portuguese-speaking. I mean, Canada is in so many ways part of the same family of countries, and the United States too. When Bill Clinton received the Charlemagne Prize, which is the leading European political prize, he said, because Europe is not just a place, but also an idea, the United States, too, is in a sense part of Europe. So there you have the great complexities of Europe. Now, what I'm going to do in the next 30 minutes is, first of all, say a little bit about the book, but I am conscious that some of you have read it, and also I did talk about it here last September, so I don't want to repeat myself too much. So I'm then going to talk a little bit about some of the issues facing Europe today. So let me start with the book. This book took me just 50 years to write. 50 years of traveling constantly around Europe, witnessing great events, meeting the major players you mentioned, the Kohls and the Putins and the Merkels and the Thatchers, but also many so-called ordinary people who are often much more extraordinary than most of our politicians, which may not be saying a great deal, and who at crucial moments made that history, 1989 being an obvious example. Studying Europe in more conventional ways and archives and libraries in both my great universities, Oxford and Stanford, writing it all down in notebooks like this one, where I may write something down about today's event, worrying about Europe, writing about Europe. It's an unusual genre. It's history illustrated by memoir and reportage. So the book is full of stories, but the stories are there not for their own sake, but to illustrate the history. They're always there with a point. I'll give you just one example. It's the day after the Berlin Wall has come down on the 9th of November 1989. They've just lifted out two great chunks of the Berlin Wall so that I'm able to walk across the Potsdamer Platz from west to east, across what used to be the death strip, where just a few days before East Germans would still have been shot for trying to escape the other way. An amazing experience. We're flooding across. I get into East Berlin, and I meet a very excited East Berliner who tells me he's just seen a handwritten poster which says, "Only today is the war really over." That's not just an anecdote. I think there's a deep sense in which, for most East Europeans and Southeast Europeans, it was only in 1989 that the war was really over. That was only when the Second World War ended. And it started a period which is a large part of this book, which I argue is a distinctive period, which I call the post-wall period. So we all know about the post-war period. My dear friend Tony Judd wrote a book about it called Post-War, post-1945, after what we used to call the war. But on the 9th of November 1989 starts a new period of European history, the post-wall period, which to some extent overlaps with the post-1945 period. Many of the institutions are still in place, but I argue is a distinctive new period, and it ends on the 24th of February 2022 with Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a war, the largest war in Europe since 1945, that is continuing to this day. So that the book is in a way bookended by the end of the Second World War, which I tell through the experience of my father, who landed with the first wave on D-Day, 6th of June, 1944, 7:30 in the morning, Vers-sur-Mer, and then all the way to the full-scale war in Ukraine. Now, of course, it's impossible in even 300 pages to begin to tell a comprehensive story of Europe over these 80 years. This is a story of Europe written from a particular point of view. It's a story of Europe and freedom, the two leitmotifs of my working life. And seen from this point of view, it has a particular shape, which Janice just alluded to. When I first started traveling to continental Europe, because of course Britain is in Europe too, in case you'd not noticed, when I started traveling to continental Europe in the very early 1970s, Europe was still a continent of dictators. Most Europeans still lived under dictatorships. We did the maths for this book. 289 million Europeans in 1972 lived in democracies, 389 million in dictatorships. Not just the whole of Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe and the Soviet Union, but Spain, Portugal, and Greece were still under dictatorships. And starting with the end of the South European dictatorships, Spain, Portugal, and Greece in the mid-1970s, essentially painting with a broad brush, you have a long ascending curve across the next 35 years of the spread of freedom in Europe, of the spread of democracy, and of the enlargement of the geopolitical West, of its two great institutions, the European Union and NATO. Think about it. 1972, the European Economic Community, as it still was, had just 6 member states. By 2007, the EU, as it has become, has 27. NATO, just 15 member states in 1972, 26 by 2007. An unprecedented spread of freedom, democracy, and the geopolitical West across our continent. Of course, it wasn't simply a straight upward line. That's not how history happens. There were major setbacks. There was a so-called state of war in Poland, imposed in December 1981. There were 5 terrible wars in former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, which I write about at length and witnessed. And there was 9/11. But one of the interesting things I found when working on this book was that while 9/11 was clearly a major turning point in the history of the Middle East and a major turning point in the history of the United States, it isn't the great turning point in European history. In European history, the great turning point is 2008. The combination within a couple of months of each other of the beginning of the global financial crisis, touched on in one of the other great books by my dear friend Harold James, and Vladimir Putin's seizure of two great chunks of Georgia, roughly 1/5 of the country's territory, in the summer, autumn of 2008, starts a cascade of crises which continues all the way down to the 24th of February 2022. So the global financial crisis in Europe segues into the Great Recession in many countries and the Eurozone crisis, which lasts for many years with terrible suffering, particularly in Greece and other South European countries. In 2010 already, Viktor Orban, who I knew as a bright young student activist in the late 1980s, starts the demolition of democracy in Hungary. Ladies and gentlemen, Hungary, a full member state of the EU, is no longer a democracy. It's not just an illiberal democracy. It's what political scientists also at this university call an electoral authoritarian regime inside the EU. 2014, of course, you have Putin's seizure of Crimea and the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian war, which, as all Ukrainians always remind us, didn't just start in 2022. It started in 2014 in eastern Ukraine. 2015, the refugee or migration crisis, Brexit, Donald Trump, the rise of populists in countries like Germany with the AfD and Marine Le Pen in France, COVID, all the way down to the 24th of February 2022 and the beginning of the largest war in Europe since 1945. Now, there's of course a great deal more to be said about this history. Read the book. But let me just touch on the question why, after such a long period when things, broadly speaking, were going so well in European history, we had this sudden downward turn and into this cascade of crisis. Hubris, our own Greek friend, is a good part of the answer. Failing to learn the lessons of history, empires which very suddenly lose a great chunk of their territory. That's the case of the Soviet Russian Empire. Don't like it, they strike back. That's what started happening in 2008 in Georgia, in a sense even before then in Chechnya, and then in spades in 2014. But in the most general terms, I would say the biggest mistake we made was a mistake in how we thought about history. To put it most simply, this was the fallacy of extrapolation. We took the way things had gone, namely, broadly speaking, rather well for liberal Europe, for the liberal West altogether over the last 35 years, and simply thought it would go on doing that way. We took the most non-linear event in modern European history, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, which was a 1 in a million example of what Machiavelli calls fortuna, historical luck, and we turned it into a linear projection. Or to state it in the most general terms, we took history with a small h, history as it actually happens, which is always the interaction between deep structure and process on the one side, and conjuncture, contingency, collective will, and individual leadership on the other. That's how history actually happens. And we turned it into history with a capital H, a Hegelian process of the inevitable spread of freedom. But freedom is not a process. Freedom is a struggle, always a struggle, even in the most established liberal democracies like Canada or Britain or the United States or France or Germany. This is what the Ukrainians are reminding us of today. Freedom is a struggle. For me, one of the words of this decade is the Ukrainian word volya. And volya is a fascinating word, specifically in the Ukrainian version, because it combines the meanings of freedom and the will to fight for it. Both are contained in that one word, volia, and that's exactly what we need. Volia. This brings me to today, where we are now, as it were, thinking about the next book. We're at the beginning of a new period of European history. And let me single out a couple of characteristics of this, of such a moment. The first is what I would call interpretive cacophony, right? So all of us, everybody, above all newspaper columnists, are seeking for some kind of overarching interpretive framework for us to make sense of this, because we feel uncomfortable if we can't make sense of things, right? So Robin Niblett, the former director of Chatham House in London, has just published a book called The New Cold War, right? China, America. Well, yes, but what about all the other great powers? So then Neil Ferguson, the historian, says we're heading towards the Third World War. Well, maybe yes, but are we really saying that the alignment of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, dangerous though it is something like the Axis in the Second World War? Are these really becoming such consolidated alliances? What about all the other great powers? What about Turkey? What about India, South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia? So perhaps, and I think again you touched on it in the introduction, what we're getting is a world of great power competition. Not like late 20th century Europe, but more like late 19th century Europe, writ large on a global scale. Great powers, empires pursuing their own national interests. Yes, but what about the unprecedented character of the Anthropocene era, that for the first time, human beings are fundamentally changing our natural environment, both biodiversity and climate change? Yes, but what about AI, this amazing technological change coming down the road? Yes, but what about what I call in my book the private superpowers, the Googles, the Amazons, the Microsofts, these truly unprecedented actors in international relations, which I think didn't exist in Lionel Gelber's time. Or maybe, as Donald Tusk, the current Polish Prime Minister and former President of the European Council, reassuringly told us, we're living in a pre-war period. Everybody grasping, looking at history to try and find the interpretive framework, because what it's like rowing across a lake into a fog bank. So you don't know what's ahead of you, but as you're rowing, what you see is what's behind. So you try and take things from history to interpret the present. It's actually quite demanding to say, no, there are going to be elements of these different historical phenomena recurring in this age, but they're coming in a new combination. And our job is to work out what the new combination is, and not just slap an old label on it. Now, connected with that is a second point. One of the arguments I make in this book is that the Europe we have today, which with all its faults, is the best Europe we've ever had. It's worth remembering that still. Was created essentially by four great generations, all of whom were driven by what I call the memory engine. That is to say, they had a formative experience in their youth, which informed their political commitment and their visions of Europe for an entire lifetime. The 14ers, shaped by their personal experience of the First World War, Churchill, de Gaulle, Adenauer. The 39ers, shaped by their experience of the Second World War, the 68ers and the 89ers. Now, for the first time, we have an entire generation of young Europeans who could be over 30 years old, having basically only known a Europe that was relatively peaceful, prosperous, free, democratic, and unprecedentedly united where you could travel pretty much from one end of the continent to the other and still be in the European Union and still be in a liberal democracy, unless you were going to Budapest. And this is a problem of success, because if that's been your experience, and of course it's not true for young Ukrainians or young Bosnians, but for most young Europeans, you naturally think it's normal, because what you've grown up with, what you've known, is normal. And our job as historians or as commentators is to say, hey guys, no. Historically speaking, it's profoundly abnormal. We've never had a Europe like this. It's deeply abnormal. And only if you can convey this sense that what feels to you like normal is actually abnormal, will people understand how deeply it's threatened and therefore mobilize to defend it. It occurred to me when I was thinking about this talk, being in Canada, that in a way, what this generation is in time, Canada is in space. That is to say, if you grew up in Canada, you might think having this wonderful, fortunate country of yours is normal. Only when you start traveling, either in space or in time, or preferably both, do you understand just how extraordinary it is, what you have in Canada and what this young generation have particularly in Western Europe. Travel in space, also known as journalism, Eric's great profession, Ian's great profession, one of my two professions. Travel in time, that's what we call history. So the challenge is, can you learn from history without having to go through it all yourself again? Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, said something very interesting at this year's Munich Security Conference. He was in a conversation basically with Olaf Scholz, who'd spoken just before him. And he said, being ready to face someone like Vladimir Putin is not just a matter of how many billion euros you spend on arms or what weapon systems you have. He said, you have to be psychologically prepared. And he said, we in Ukraine, because the war started 10 years ago in 2014, we're psychologically prepared for the war. You're not. You may be putting up the money, but you're not psychologically prepared for it. So can you learn from history without going through it yourself? And this brings me to the third point, which is beginnings in history, as in romance, are particularly important. What you do in those first months or years, you mentioned Meg Ryan, is more important, dare I say, than what you might do in your 27th year of marriage. And it's the same with European orders. Those first years are absolutely crucial when everything is so wide open. So think about it. The first 5 years after 1945 shaped the liberal international order, certainly for the next 50 years and in many respects to this day. And it was wide open. There were multiple possibilities at that time. The first 5 years after 1989 shaped the next 30 years in Europe. So what we do in Europe and in the wider West in these years is going to shape Europe and the world for decades to come. Now, there are many issues one could talk about in this respect. I could talk about Israel, Gaza, the Middle East. I could talk about the prospect of Donald Trump again being elected President of the United States on the 5th of November, Guy Fawkes Day, by the way, suitably enough. But also more structurally, the fact that Trump or no Trump, the United States' interest in Europe has diminished, is diminishing, and will continue to diminish. That's just a structural fact. I could talk about the European elections and the prospect of hard-right nationalist populists, the AfD in Germany, Marine Le Pen in France, doing extremely well. I could talk about China, where Olaf Scholz has just been drumming up more business for German companies. I could talk about Britain, if you'd like me to. and the prospect of our rapprochement with the EU after the next election, or climate change, or inequality. I want to spend the last few minutes talking about the subject closest to my heart, which is Ukraine. I've spent roughly half my time now on Ukraine. I've been 4 times since the beginning of the full-scale war. Chronologically, the last chapter of the book is about the war in Ukraine. Last year, when I was there in February and again in June, there was tremendous optimism. There was high morale, high hopes of the counteroffensive. When I was last there in October, people were getting extremely worried that the exhaustion, the traumatization, but also the sense that the counteroffensive wasn't working. I'm going back again next month, and I know that the atmosphere will be much darker, much gloomier, because the counteroffensive failed for reasons we could discuss. Ukraine has had significant successes. It's important to say they've destroyed a large part of the Black Sea Fleet and pushed it away from Crimea. That's an amazing achievement. But their cities like Kharkiv, are being absolutely hammered as the air defenses are overwhelmed, and they're gradually being pushed back by the grinding forward of Russian forces in the east. Now, some of the reasons for this are to be found in Ukraine itself. That's important to say. It's not all us. But the most important reason is the disparity between what we in the West have done and what Russia and its allies have done. Russia has converted to a war economy rapidly and effectively, and it's got more ammunition from North Korea alone than the entirety of Europe has given to Ukraine. And the Russians have found a particular kind of weapon, improvised, the so-called glide bombs, which are absolutely devastating. So at the moment, Ukraine is losing. And as you all know, that crucial $60 billion is being held up by hyperpolarized US politics. But for me, this one is really on Europe. I hate to say this, but even Donald Trump might have had a point when he said to Europeans during his first term in office, "Why are you still depending on us for your own defense so much then 70, 75 years after the end of the Second World War? Yeah? Why aren't you doing more? You're as rich as us. Why aren't you doing more for your own defense?" Absolutely. I don't think we should, as Europeans, 80 years after D-Day, 6th of June this year, the 80th anniversary of D-Day, should still be looking to Uncle Sam to do the bulk of the work. There's some things which we still need the US for, there's no question about that. But I think this is a case where Europe really has to step up to the plate in commissioning our and building up our defense industry. We have one particular missile type. I mentioned the Russian glide bombs. Germany has a missile called the Taurus. It's a very sophisticated cruise missile. Germany has 600 of them. In a leaked conversation between German Air Force officers, they said somewhere between 10 and 20 of these missiles could take down the Kerch Bridge, which connects Russia to Crimea. Using those missiles, Ukraine could actually put Russia onto the back foot now, this summer, even while Russian forces are grinding forward in the east, so there's much that we could do now. But what I increasingly hear in Europe and elsewhere is a line of argument which goes, well, particularly if Donald Trump is elected on the 5th of November, this is how it's going to end. It's going to be a frozen conflict or a semi-frozen conflict with some sort of territorial line of division somewhere through Ukraine. And people argue this can actually be seen as a great success. That, after all, Ukraine has defended itself, it's still a democracy, it's going to come into the EU and NATO. Let's redefine that as victory. And what I want to say very forcefully to you, and this is my last big point, don't believe it. If this is how it's end, and I'm afraid, I have to say in all honesty, that is now probable, that is defeat. We may say until we're blue in the face, it's a kind of victory. Every single Ukrainian will see it as a huge defeat. You've suffered so much, and you've lost 1/5 of your country, a territory the size of Portugal and most of Slovenia, where millions of Ukrainians lived. I've met them, I'm sure Eric has too. I've talked to people who tell you about Mariupol or Novakakovka. They show you their houses on Google Maps, and they're not going to be able to go back there unless they're going to live under an alien dictatorship, speaking a language they no longer want to speak. The country, Ukraine, would be defeated. It would be demoralized. It would be further depopulated. There's already been a massive exodus of people. This would continue. Instead of the wives and children who are now outside the country going back to join the husbands would come out to join the wives and children, which would be great for the German labor market, by the way, but not great for Ukraine. And the politics of Ukraine, which are already quite fractious, would then become embittered and rancorous and divided, and there'd be a lot of blame game, both internally and blaming the West. And that means, and by the way, NATO, the United States does not even want Ukraine's NATO candidacy to be put on the agenda for the Washington summit this summer. And we talk about Ukraine really becoming security assurances. I'd love to believe them, but Ukraine has its own experience with security assurances. And EU, it's just a candidate. That's just the starting line. There are countries in the Western Balkans that have been candidates for nearly 20 years. And if the politics go sour inside Ukraine and you don't get this positive upward spiral of reconstruction and reform, then EU member states who don't want the enlargement anyway will have plenty of reasons for putting it on the never, never. In Russia, Vladimir Putin could declare victory. If he's got Crimea and most of, if not all of, the 4 oblasts which he has already declared are part of Russia, that's a political victory. I have won back Novorossiya, the territory that Catherine the Great got for Russia in the 18th century. I have won it back, and that means Putin is in power for years to come. And so long as Putin is in power, the rest of Europe is not safe. He would regroup, take a year or two, and then maybe have a go at Moldova, which has a little breakaway region called Transnistria with a Russian armed forces on it, try something hybrid on the edge of NATO. So Russia would remain under Putin's rule, Europe be insecure, and last but not least, in the eyes of the rest of the world, this would be a defeat, not just for Ukraine, but for the West. My Oxford research project, Europe in a Changing World, did a big global poll with the European Council on Foreign Relations. China, India, Turkey, Russia, US, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, 10 major non-European countries. People there think 3 things. This is not a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's a war between Russia and the West, number 1. Number 2, they think Russia is likely to win. And number 3, majorities or pluralities in most of these countries think the EU is likely to fall apart within the next 20 years. And what is more, there's a correlation between those groups. So those who think Russia is likely to win are those who think the EU is likely to fall apart. You couldn't have a more telling demonstration of how our own credibility as Europe and as the West, is at stake in the outcome of the war in Ukraine. And so in this crucial beginning period, it is absolutely vital, of course, that Canada and the US, but above all, that we in Europe do more to ensure that Ukraine gets to somewhere that can credibly be called victory, and Russia to something that can only be called defeat. That's up to our states, our leaders, our democracies, but it also involves our own participation as citizens. And there's a nice saying, one should put one's money where your mouth is. You should put your money where your mouth is, which I think is a sound principle. And so I have decided that I will dedicate, pass on the very generous prize money from this prize for the defense of Ukraine, particularly for the air defenses of embattled cities like Kharkiv and Kramatorsk and others in the east. I hope you will feel that that's a good way to use a Canadian prize for a book about our European homelands. Thank you very much. I look forward very much to the discussion.
Thank you very, very much, Timothy. This is being recorded for CBC Ideas, which will run a series of programs based on this. So if you wouldn't mind, we have Munk School students here with cards. Right there, if you stand up so people can see you. You'll be walking around the room. If you could put your question on the card, they'll bring them to me. Because I will speak into the microphone, they will become part of the official recording of the event. While we're waiting for that to happen, Timothy, let me just ask you two questions. Start where you stopped, which was frankly a fairly, when you said the word probable about Ukraine losing, that's a very strong statement coming from a historian, let me tell you. They often don't talk that way. And then you said, but it's on us. It's on Europe, and it's on the citizens of Europe to mobilize resources, to deepen the military-industrial manufacturing processes in Europe, because we're talking about the failure to manufacture artillery shells. Walk us through another outcome. What is a path over the next 2 years to another outcome?
Well, first of all, if you have a vote in the United States, and I know one or two of you do, I would suggest you use it in one way and not the other, because obviously the United States has been absolutely crucial to military support for Ukraine, and therefore having Trump pull the rug out from under Ukraine makes it very, very difficult to get a good outcome. Let's be optimistic. You're inviting us to be optimistic and assume that it's not Trump and that the US continues roughly on its current course. I don't think we can expect the United States to do much more, any major new levels of support. Therefore, we in Europe have 6 to 9 months to, as you said, rapidly step up our own defense industry. But remember, the German economy alone is twice the size of Russia's. The European economies together are 10 times the size of Russia's. I mean, our economic potential and our military technology is vastly superior. So it's objectively possible to do that. And I'm afraid politically, our problem in Europe, though, is that we have some wonderful leaders, but they're mainly in smaller countries, right? So Kaja Kallas in Estonia is fantastic. Mette Frederiksen in Denmark is fantastic. Actually, Ursula von der Leyen is doing a great job in the EU. But until recently, we couldn't say that of France. And above all, we can't say it of Germany. I've just written an essay about what I'm calling the new German question for the New York Review of Books. The Federal Republic of Germany is 75 this May. May the 23rd is its birthday. And this is one of those moments where really the German position is crucial. So if I'm trying to be optimistic, it has to be a significant change of the strategic position taken by Germany, which becomes one of the leaders in not just saying we want Ukraine not to lose, which is the formula currently used by Scholz, not to lose. I don't know what that means. But actually we wanted to win.
That is a very ambiguous formula he uses, Ukraine not losing. Timothy, let me ask you about writing contemporary history. Frank Avanis, I had the privilege of reading an early draft of a manuscript on historical sensibility, as Frank calls it. And he went through an exercise which has stayed with me, and it influences a lot of what I think. There's a whole wonderful chapter on a history of the Cold War. And the first time the historian writes it is in 1965, and it tells one story. And then you read it again in 1985, you tell a completely different story. And you read it again in 95, you have a different story. You write it after the global financial crisis, it's a different story. And I suspect if we write it in 2025, it would be entirely different. And that's not only because we uncover new documents. It's because we think about history in part from where we are. What do you tell your graduate students about writing contemporary history? And what do you tell them about the lessons of history?
Yeah, a great question. I mean, how long do we have? But so it's important to say that from the time of Thucydides until the 18th century, the general view was that contemporary history is the best history. Because actually, you know better what it was like when you were there, when you saw it yourself. I mean, who knows better what it was like to be in this room this lunchtime? You or some historian 40 years hence? We do. It's only since the 19th century, Leopold von Ranke, that we had this idea that you have to wait 30 years and get all the documents and have the perspective. And so I've been doing this, as you know, for 50 years.
Yeah.
I remember an elderly Don, when I started doing this 50 years ago, he said, "Oh, contemporary history, you mean journalism with footnotes." that was a stuffy view.
That's an insult.
Yeah, it was a very gentle insult, anyway. But here's the thing. It has huge advantages and one obvious disadvantage. The huge advantage is that you are documenting things that only you have seen. I was the only person writing it down in the Magic Lantern Theatre in Prague in 1989, right? That stuff would have disappeared. I know what it was like to be there. I know what it felt like. And above all, I know what people didn't know at the time. This is so important. Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, talks about the illusions of retrospective determinism, the almost irresistible temptation to believe that what actually happened somehow had to happen. Right? Like the Berlin Wall had to come down. Not a bit of it. So you know what you know. And as for the documents, honestly, these days, Janice, yeah, occasionally there's a crucial document which is released 20 years later. But on the whole, these days, our problem is we have too many sources, not too few. So sometimes the big thing you don't know is the consequences, as you exactly said. And so one just has to acknowledge that those are the pluses and the minuses of contemporary history, which is why it's been so interesting going back over things I wrote about the time for this book, because that period has ended, one really sees some of the longer-term consequences.
And that really comes through in the book. It's got such a contemporary feeling because so much of it. You know, as you were you in Berlin in 1989?
I was indeed.
That's right, because the description is so vivid. I thought that had to be written by somebody who was actually there. And the story you told of East German and the kind of joy of discovery and exhilaration. Now, if you go to that part of Germany today, that is home to the AfD. A bridge to both questions. When you talk about the struggle for freedom, it is associated, that's not cause, but associated with the development of liberal democracy. And you have led that discussion in Europe on liberalism and on liberal democracy. When you think about these next 10 years, if we went to speak to that East German today, we might hear a very different story than you heard in 1989 because of disappointment with liberal democracy. And you have talked, and I want you to take just a few minutes because I personally believe it's so important. You have talked about the imperative for you as a historian to be excruciatingly honest about the weaknesses of what you defend, rather than simply blame the other. And you just did that with respect to Ukraine. Think forward about liberal democracy, about the disappointments among those who were most joyous. What have we learned?
So there's a slightly sterile discussion about populism, which is it economics or is it culture? And the answer is it's always both in some combination. And for me, the key term is inequality. On the one hand, it's inequality of income and property, inherited wealth, right? So that again and again, when you look at the populist votes, one of the key elements is the housing crisis. The fact that a lot of people just can't afford housing. You may have a little of that here.
Yeah.
But then there's the cultural component, which is what I call inequality of attention and respect, right? So that there are a lot of people in our societies, in smaller towns, in the countryside, without higher education, who simply feel that they are ignored and disrespected and not seen by liberal metropolitan elites, by people like us. And the AfD in East Germany is so interesting because actually the economic component is much, much smaller there. Actually, AfD voters have a higher per capita average income than the average voter in Germany. And a huge amount of money has been pumped into East Germany. But the cultural dimension is enormous. Most East Germans, my East German friends, just feel that they're treated as second-class citizens, that they're by their West German compatriots. It's quite an achievement, in a way, to have created a kind of, to put it rather starkly, colonialism in one country. But that's what they've done, so that, in short, addressing the economic inequality is an important part of the agenda, no question, but the cultural inequality, the sense of recognition and respect, is at least as important.
Now, to ask you a very unfair follow-up, is that true of the United States as well? Is there colonialism in one country?
Well, I wouldn't quite put it in those terms, but I think that there's no question at all, if you look at the studies of recent American populism, that precisely what I've described is very, very strongly present in the United States, absolutely, no question at all. And it's also, by the way, if I may just say something about politicians. So representation has at least two meanings, doesn't it? It's an elected representative in the political system, but it's also I see the people up there on the political stage and I feel represented. It's someone like me. Now, back in the day, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, we had quite a lot of politicians who came from working class backgrounds, hadn't gone to university, and, the other parts of our societies really felt represented by them, almost in the sense one talks about a character being represented on stage. Now, certainly in most West European countries, all politicians have been to university. Many of them read PPE at Oxford, poor things. We have a lot to answer for at Oxford. And they belong to this, remote professional caste, and people sense that. And then a Nigel Farage or a Donald Trump comes along, and they manage to convey the sense, however misleadingly, hey, that's someone like that. He gets it. He speaks like me.
So as a liberal, which you are a passionate liberal, and so much of your research and the projects that you lead have been to deepen liberalism. As a liberal, how do you encourage other liberals to engage respectfully with people who don't share liberal values?
Well, I like to say, ich bin ein Berliner, by which I mean not that I live in Berlin, but I'm an Isaiah Berliner. Isaiah Berlin, the great liberal philosopher, is one of my heroes. And one of his great themes was diversity, liberty and pluralism. Actually, liberty is not liberty if it's just for the liberals. It has to embrace diversity. It has actually, as John Stuart Mill famously argued, to welcome a radical critique of your own views. And that's what some of contemporary liberalism, I think, has lost. And we see it, by the way, in our own universities, too. Yes. So getting back to a more classical liberalism in that sense, to John Stuart Mill, the embrace of critical views, being more Berliners, I think, is part of the answer.
I think that is a discussion that every faculty member in this room is having in one way or another. Yeah. Just before, was it Judith or Peter who said that we have a Gelber Book Club at the Munk School? So just a heads up, I'm going to invite you to come up and share your thoughts in a minute. But here's a wonderful question from a student in the audience. Is there a story that you were not able to fit into this book that you really want to share?
Gosh, I had quite a few of them. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to tell you one which is really just for fun. Is that okay?
Yes,
Are we allowed to have a bit of fun?
We're allowed to have fun.
We've had some very serious matter here. I told it at dinner last night. The 250th anniversary of the London Times. I was then writing editorials for the London Times, and so we have a visit, as one must, from the Queen. Remember, the Queen. And she is sitting beside the editor, behind the editor, Rupert Murdoch in the middle, and the Duke of Edinburgh on the other side. And we're discussing a British spy, one of the British spies for the Soviet Union who's just been exposed, the so-called fourth man, and we're having a very nuanced discussion. And suddenly a voice from behind the editor says, "But the man's a shit, isn't he? Just a bloody shit." This was the Duke of Edinburgh. There was kind of awful, awkward silence, and then my wonderful colleague Edward Mortimer said, "Well, indeed, sir, you could say that from a certain point of view, but on the other hand," and da-di-da-di-da. Anyway, at the end of this rather surreal editorial writers' meeting, the editor turns around to the Queen and says, "You see, Your Majesty, and our proprietor didn't interfere at all." And the Queen said, "No, indeed, not a squeak." And I've always thought that was the moment where Rupert Murdoch really took against the royal family. Anyway, but that's just for fun.
Can I invite the members of the Gelber Book Club to the podium? And these students read all 5 of the shortlisted books, which is wonderful. This is an idea that Ariana brought forward this year, and so we're waiting to hear from you.
Yes, thank you. So, good afternoon, everyone. I can speak for all of us when it's so difficult to follow up such amazing speakers, but my name is Jacob Koltosi, and I'm pleased to be joined by two fellow Munk students and friends, Emily Crispus and Matthew Chasmar. And we are so thrilled to be representatives today of the Munk and the Lionel Gelber Prize Book Club. Our club was made up of a diverse group of undergraduate and graduate students from an assortment of Munk programs, and we met weekly to discuss the amazing array of Gelber Prize books that were on display this year. In these weekly meetings, we had the unique chance to delve into and discuss the shortlisted books, comparing opinions and connecting the stories we were reading to concepts which we were not only discussing in class, but also which we heard their importance in the world more broadly, and that was a really crucial foundation. Among the outstanding books we explored, we all felt that Homelands stood apart. What made Homelands exceptional was its ability to convey profound messages of finding peace within difference, a theme that you've heard throughout the conversation today. And this was a particularly powerful thread to us in such a polarized world. It was not only guiding in our discussions, but it also left a lasting curiosity for us as we moved through the rest of our discussions in the book club as well.
For each of us, Homelands was a chance to approach a new book with an open mind each week. And sitting down to read Homelands, I was immediately struck by the enormity of the task of telling the history of Europe from 1945 until today. Yet this is a task that Timothy Garton Ash tackles with aplomb. The stories are enriched with a deep knowledge of Europe's history, art, and culture, whether describing High Mass at Charlemagne's church, the beaches of Normandy, his first-hand experiences of East Berlin, or the literary legacy of Hamlet. The depth he brings to each chapter is remarkable and captivating. It's not just how he tells the story of Europe that makes Homeland stand out, but also how Professor Garton Ash tells his own personal story, the two narratives intersecting, complementing, and ultimately illuminating each other. I found his grasp not only of Europe's history, but his own personal story to be both impressive and inspirational.
While Homelands is a work of literature that offers a rich and personal reflection on Europe's historical experience, it presents a compelling, if hopeful, analog for the present. We watch in horror as the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East escalate, but Homelands provides a glimmer of hope. Beginning in the shadows of World War II, Homelands is ultimately a story of deep conflict and remarkable resolution. Timothy Garton Ash reminds us that the default of the human spirit is to contend for distinct identities, find meaning in upheaval, and to ultimately pave avenues along which we can arrive at peace. Although reading these pages was a personal experience, the book club was an exercise in sharing, and not only of snacks. We couldn't have wished for a better starting point than Homelands. Its stories and the extensive knowledge imbued within the pages meant that each student resonated with the book in their own ways. Whether it was because of a personal history or previous academic studies, we all felt a connection to the book as both learners and as individuals. These varied interpretations led to captivating conversation. As a parting message from us all, we encourage you not only to pick up this book for yourselves, but also form your own reading groups. I can assure you you'll take much more out of it over a cup of coffee or tea, depending on your preference. Finally, a warm thank you for having us, to Isaac Lother and to Ariana for supporting our discussions, and especially to Professor Garton Ash for not only your words, but also your heart that you put into this book. Thank you all so much.
You know, as teachers, I always say the greatest return on investment that we get are students like this. I'm looking at my watch and I have time to share one story with Timothy Garton Ash, which you can now add to your repertoire, and it is indiscreet. All right, so I'm going to ask CBC to edit out this story from the tape. So we had somebody in Canada that I hope you had the privilege of meeting, Hugh Segal, who's a senator from Canada, who was asked by the Queen to serve on the eminent persons group of the Commonwealth because the Queen cared a great deal about updating the Commonwealth, and he agreed. And so he got to know the Queen, and she got to know him. And he was at a garden party in Buckingham Palace. And up comes Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, and says to him, Senator Seagull, are you from that country, Canada, that speaks French? Well, you didn't know quite to do with himself. He said, yes, sir. He said, well, I'm going to test how good your French is. She was getting nervous. And he said, what does tant pis, tant mieux mean? Well, says Hugh Seagull, I think it means a little worse, a little better. No, not at all, says the Duke. It means my aunt took a piss. And how good is that? Well, if you think that's the end of the story, it's not.
I never thought that this ceremony would end with Duke of Edinburgh stories.
There you go. We need some humor. And Hugh turns red and looks up. And then, as he said to me, the Queen rolled in behind and said, Senator Seagull, I suggest that you do what I've been doing for 55 years. Ignore him. Judith, would you come up to the podium, please, to present? And Timothy, if you join Judith so that you can present the check. The prize.